Hi, students. Today we're going to cover how angiosperms reproduce. So angiosperms, recall, are the most successful land plants, and part of the reason they're the most successful is because they produce not only seeds, not only do they have vascular tissue, but now they also have flowers. All right, so we're going to talk about reproduction and how the flower facilitates this. So we are going to cover first parts of the flower, then we're going to discuss how pollination and fertilization take place, then what a fruit is and how they're. Okay, so now we're going to talk about how the big picture overview of how reproduction takes place in an angiosperm. And I will like to remind you that plants have what we call alternation of generation. So if you think of humans, we have gametes, right? Egg and sperm, and those are the only haploid cells in our body. Plants, starting with the mosses, actually their dominant form, the one we saw, the moss, was a haploid, or was made up of haploid cells. All right, and that's called the gametophyte generation. And then the diploid is the sporophyte generation. And usually the sporophytes produce spores via meiosis, which forms into the gametophyte via mitosis. And then the gametophyte produces the egg and sperm, which fuse to form the sporophyte, which is diploid. In plants, as they evolved, that sporophyte generation, which was the not dominant one in the mosses, became more and more dominant. So you can think of it, they're being more and more like humans. Like our dominant stage is diploid. So flowers have a dominant sporophyte or diploid generation. So what we see in flowering plants is the sporophyte. It's the diploid. So here in this picture, you see the sporophyte on top is the flower, everything we visually see. So plants have two-stage alternating life cycle, right? Sporophyte is the dominant generation that you see. So the sporophyte produces the haploid spores via meiosis, right, to get from diploid to haploid. Remember, meiosis reduces the chromosome numbers. Haploid cells have only one of each pair of chromosomes. And that produces, and I'm not going to have you remember the micro versus the megaspore, but basically the male part of the flower, which is the anther, produces the microspores, which eventually become the pollen grain. Now we're talking about the haploid gametophyte, and in the pollen of the flower is where the sperm are. All right, then the female part of the flower is this ovary, and that in the sporophyte cells undergo meiosis to produce the female megaspores, right, which are the female gametophyte, become these embryo sacs inside, which have the egg that gets fertilized by the sperm to make the zygote, and then the whole ovary becomes the seed, right? When the seed germinates via mitosis, now we're getting the big sporophyte again. So sporophyte produces the haploid spores by meiosis. Spores become haploid gametophytes, right? The gametes, the egg and the sperm. Gametophytes produce gametes, egg and sperm. Gametes fuse to produce a diploid zygote, which is now the sporophyte generation. The zygote divides to become the diploid sporophyte, right? Or it is actually, because it's diploid, the larger structure. Okay, you do need to know these parts of the flower. And so they occur kind of in whorls and circles. So remember, a flower was originally a bud. And sometimes picture like a rosebud that has the green things that are over it. Those are the sepals. So the sepals protect the bud before it opens up. The petals are the showy part of the flower. And the reason they're showy is to attract pollinators, because angiosperms have evolved to have this symbiotic relationship with insects because the insects help pollination happen because they're attracted to generally the colors in the flowers. Like bees are attracted to yellow flowers, think of dandelions. So they've evolved to attract the pollinators to help pollination happen. Pollination is the transfer of the pollen from the anther to the top of the female part, the stigma, and that an insect facilitates, right? And then that allows then fertilization to happen when the sperm from the pollen goes into the ovary and fertilizes the ovules inside. All right, so the petals attract the pollinators. The stamens, okay, think of stamen. This is the male portion. Men have the anther, right, which is this bigger container that's going to hold the pollen. And then the filament, which is the stalk that holds the anther up. Those two components make up the stamen, the male portion. The carpel is the female portion. So the carpel is all of this. It's made up of the stigma. I sometimes say sticky stigma. This is sticky because the pollen lands on it and the stickiness allows the pollen to stay. The style is this long tube where eventually the sperm will swim down. I used to say swimming down in style. And then the ovary here, right, is enlarged and it contains these ovules, which house the eggs that are going to get fertilized. Okay. Now, the life cycle, if we keep track of all the cells and everything, is going to be, it has a lot of detail. So I'm going to try to simplify it for everyone. And actually that picture in my first slide kind of had a simplified picture, but it was missing something. So if we start with the flower, right, and you remember this is the sporophyte, right? This is the diploid structure. And we have male and female parts, right? The stamen, which had the anther and the filament, right? And the carpel, which had the stigma, style, and ovary. So the anther, right? The anther contains these cells. We're in the sporophytes. Sporophytes produce spores that are going to divide via meiosis to produce these microspores, we call them, which eventually divide a few more times to produce the pollen grains. And these pollen grains have kind of two cells in them. We're going to talk about that later. And that's what's going on in the male portion. So the anther has these cells that start dividing via meiosis, and there the male gametes, the male gametophyte, are going to form. Think of sperm, right? So development, right, of the sperm happens. Then the female portion, right, has the stigma, style, ovary. In the ovary, there are cells that are going to divide via meiosis as well and produce, think meiosis, remember humans produces 4 cells. They produce these 4 cells, right? And one of them is going to become the egg. All right, so the egg is inside. And then what happens is that the pollen will land, so pollination. So pollination refers to here. When the pollen actually lands on the stigma, we're going to talk in 2 more slides about how this tube forms. And there's 2 sperm in the pollen grain, right? The pollen grain contains the sperm that are going to swim down into the ovary and fertilize the egg. It's actually double fertilization, but we're not going to get into that too much. And when that happens, the ovule becomes the seed after that fertilization takes place. So the ovule develops into a seed that contains the embryo, right? And the seed also contains nourishment for the embryo. Remember we talked about the cotyledons, and that will grow into the mature sporophyte. So to recap, the male anther contains cells that are undergoing meiosis to produce the pollen, basically, because the pollen has the sperm, right? So that's the gamete, male gamete. That pollen will land on the stigma. In the same time, that ovary contains cells that are going to undergo meiosis and produce the female egg inside that ovule. That ovule, when the pollen lands on the stigma, that's pollination, will cause a tube to form so the sperm can move down where the egg is, and then that's where fertilization will take place. So pollination is just the transfer of pollen from the anther to the stigma of the carpel, the sticky stigma. There's something called self-pollination. If it's the same plant, the pollen from the same plant is going on the stigma, or there could be cross-pollination when it's from different plants. Either one can occur. Fertilization now is after the pollination has happened. So once pollination has happened, then fertilization can occur. And that's when the pollen grain lands on the stigma, right? That's pollination. It germinates. And this tube, here's this image. So see pollination, it landed on this tube, forms down all the way to where the egg is so that the sperm can swim into that ovule, fertilize that large egg, right? And then that becomes the seed. I mentioned this earlier, but plants kind of evolved with their pollinators. So why are some plants yellow? Why are some red? Because different insects see and are attracted to different colors. And then usually, if you can see this bee, see how it's got pollen all over. They're attracted to the color and they stay there because plants also make nectar, which is just a sugary liquid. That's whole purpose is to feed these insects. But in the process, the pollen from the anther is getting on the insect and landing then on the sticky stigmas. And then the bee will go from one flower to another. So they're helping with the cross-pollination. Some may just self-pollinate and land in the same one. So they're facilitating the reproduction for these plants. Some flowers are shaped so right? So look at this one that this little hummingbird is on. The nectar is inside the base of the flower. But in the meantime, these anthers are sticking out. And so the hummingbird is getting the pollen all over it. The same thing with these bats. And the bats are out at night. So notice this flower is white because it doesn't have to be colorful. So after pollination happens, then fertilization happens. And once that sperm from the pollen fertilizes the egg in the ovule, that ovule becomes the seed, okay? And around the seed, remember the ovule was inside that ovary, that becomes the fruit, all right? So a fruit is a mature ovary with all of the ovules inside. There's different types of fruits. There's simple ones, right, that just have one seed, or there are these aggregate fruits, so that have many of these. There are many ovaries, right? So there's all these different classifications. Actually, the helicopter from a maple tree is a fruit as well. Think of a peas. That's inside of a container. That's a fruit as well. And the fruit is an adaptation as well because the fruit contains the seeds inside and the fruit aids in dispersing of those seeds, right? Because plants don't want to just have their seeds fall right next to them. They want to expand. They want to grow in various areas where they will maybe have more chances of surviving. All right, so some dry fruits, such as you've all seen the wings of a maple tree, right? That's a dry fruit. Those are dispersed not by an animal, but by wind, right? So they've evolved to have a shape that allows wind to disperse them. Other fruits attract animals to eat the fruit, and then they eat the fruit because it's nourishment. And then the seeds, they don't digest them. So they move to other places and they release them when they go to the bathroom. Burrs you can see this dog, are also fruits that have evolved to attach to animals, and then they fall off in other places. All right, that's it for this lecture. Hope you guys did well with it. Take care.